Josh is an award-winning and best-selling author whose debut novel, Call Me Evie, which was published in 2018, won the Ngā Marsh Award for Best First Novel. In The Clearing, which was published in 2019, and The Last Guests in 2021 were critically acclaimed bestsellers, with In The Clearing now being a Disney Plus original series. He then published Tell Me Lies 2020, which was a #1 Audible bestseller, and it was shortlisted for the Ngā Marsh Award for Best Novel and the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction. His fifth book, The Wrong Woman, was an international bestseller. Home Before Night, his most recent novel, which was a sixth novel, was first published as an Audible original. I've read all of his books, and they're really good whānau. It's really impressive that someone can crack out that many novels, for starters, but it's also hugely impressive if you've read them, that feeling in your puku of uncertainty and, oh my gosh, what's going to happen, that's the kind of stuff that I think Josh is really good at, but he can tell us what he's really good at soon. Now, it says here Josh was born in Rotorua and that he now resides in Melbourne with his wife and daughter. So let's give it up, whānau, for one of Rotorua's finest, Josh.
Kia ora, thank you for that comprehensive overview of all my work. So it's always exciting to come home, even more so when I get to do it as part of a sort of work trip. But it's also terrifying being back here. I spoke in front of a room full of teenagers yesterday, and I just, for a moment when I was up there, I imagined myself in those seats and how much I would just rip the piss out of a nerd coming to try to convince me that books and writing and ideas are important. So that was terrifying, but this is terrifying equally so. I've had lots of cool things happen so far, career-wise. I've spoken in front of big audiences. I've met the head of fiction for Penguin in the US, and spoken with Hollywood, have had a long lunch in LA with Hollywood types, and all sorts of cool things have happened. And it's all pretty intimidating, but there's nothing more intimidating than seeing a familiar face from my teen years in the crowd. And in terms of when you start to get some sort of confidence, or your head starts to swell, there's always someone who will remind me about when I blew up half our kitchen with a sprinkler bomb, or when I asked Bill English if he thought Helen Clark had a moustache, to my teacher's chagrin, and also just some of the exploits, getting kicked out of Boys High and getting kicked out of my for any number of indiscretions, but getting kicked out of my hostel at uni, and there's all sorts of stuff that my new friends don't really know about, and I come back here and everyone reminds me. The only other person who manages to sort of conquer my ego in that way is my wife, who's not here. She didn't come over with me, but whenever I'm having a dinner or I'm in a situation where I'm trying to impress intellectual types and other writers or whatever, she'll bring up a story when my first book was coming out and I was editing it, and I got a bit huffy. I'm like, oh, this editor keeps changing this. They don't understand. She's like, what is it? I'm like, they think, type A personality. They think it's TYPE space A, like type A personality. They don't realise it's type A, like the country, Chinese type A. And so she likes to remind me of that. She likes to remind me, another time I was editing and it was a similar situation. I'm like, they keep changing it to the American spelling of surname. And she goes, what do you mean? They keep spelling S-U-R name instead of S-I-R name, and I have to keep changing it back. So she'll do this. She'll do this at any point in time when I feel like I'm getting too big for my boots. She'll remind me quite publicly. about my, embarrassing moments. But I was a little shit at high school and at uni, and everyone in this room's, maybe you don't know that, but anyone who knew me back then probably senses things have changed a little bit on that front. But on to a couple of things, really cool things that have happened that have also kind of grounded me, some interesting stories. As we mentioned earlier, there was a Disney thing which was really cool. That was exciting. The whole process was really fun. But we went out onto set a couple of times when they were shooting, and I got to meet like Miranda Otto and Teresa Palmer and a few like kind of big stars. And there was Guy Pearce was there, and it was the end of the day, and they were about to shoot a film. And I remember it distinctly. We're just sort of waiting there, and we're supposed to be extras, so we're in these ridiculous costumes, and we're just sort of waiting there. And I was sort of looking at Guy Pearce, and then one of the associate producers came up and goes, "Oh, do you want to meet Guy?" I'm like, "Yeah, we've got to go, but just really quickly." And I remember looking over, and she walked up to him and was like, "Hey, Guy," and we could hear. We're only like a couple of minutes. "Hey, Guy, the author of the book, he's just up here." And he sort of looked over, and he was talking to her, and he did this kind of thing. And she came back really diplomatically. He's like, "Oh, next time you're on set, it's just we've got to quickly shoot. We need to get you off the street." And so I sort of rushed out. And the real salt in the wound was we got dressed up, did our hair. She said, "Don't shave," because it's set in, the scenes we're in were set in the 80s or something. She said, just don't shave and have a moustache. I'm like, cool. So I grew this, I looked ridiculous for months leading up to this. And then she said, "Grow your hair because it's 80s, like don't get a haircut." So I just looked like, I was wearing normal clothes, but I looked like I was in the 70s or 80s. And anyway, we shot the scene, and it was cool, and we're in there over and over, and they just I didn't realise in film, they redo the scene like 20 times, and you just sort of sit there. And the first thing that was a bit odd was these extras, and this is their big break. The director when we got there, the director just walked over to these two extras, who were at the front of the scene. They go, "You two, we're going to put you at the back." And I just saw this sort of sadness. I was like, "Oh, we can go at the back." It's like, no, we'll get you in here because we want you in the shot. Anyway, I told everyone I knew that this was happening. And I'm like, "You've got to watch it. I'm in this scene, I'm at this thing." And we're at the premiere, and so I had my agent next to me and Paige next to me. And while the scene was going, we'd sort of lean with the camera whenever it got close. And we'd sort of lean. And then my daughter, who was dressed up, was on Paige's lap. And then Paige starts tapping me, and we're just amorphous blobs. In the back, like there's no defining features or we could be anyone. So that was a real hard moment as well. But yeah, so it has been a bit of a ride, ups and downs. Mostly ups, but it is good, as I said, to come back and be reminded by my dad and everyone else how what I'm really like. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I know this is about crime fiction, which is vague and broad enough for me just to talk about anything really. But I'm going to tell you about a pretty interesting crime story. That's a true crime. So there's this guy. You may know who this is about, but there was this guy, and he was at home, and it was the middle of the day, and it was the March the 3rd in 2021, and he'd just gotten out of the shower. A pretty normal Monday. His little daughter was asleep. I think, again, you might be able to figure out who this is actually about. He went to the room. The Super Bowl was on that day, so he's like, "Oh, I'll check out what's happening there." It's about 10 a.m. Opens the laptop, has it on, has the baby monitor right next to the bed beside him, and has a look. Oh, yep, baby's okay. Watches a bit, gets dressed, got out of the shower. Should point that out. Was fully clothed, and so he hears. I don't know. Maybe just a show of hands. Has anyone heard a real scream, like an actual proper scream, right? So I mean, this person hadn't heard a real scream before, and didn't realise that it's completely involuntary, right? Like a scream you don't think about it when you scream. You just suddenly, you're completely alive, completely energised. This kind of energy escapes, and a scream's, and as far as I'm concerned, the kind of the only function of a scream is to warn people. Look this way, come here, this is an emergency. So there was this sort of scream that was louder and instantly communicated to this guy on his bed that something was wrong. And his first instinct, as is the case when you have young children, is to think there must be something wrong with the children. So I don't know if there's much room for cognition when you're suddenly that energized, that alarmed. So he didn't look at the baby monitor which was beside him and this kind of magic thinking logic, just assumed his wife who'd screamed had seen something on the baby monitor. And suddenly, as is the case again when you think about your children, you think about the worst case scenarios. And he imagined that there was some scissors in the room and this toddler had poked them into from her cot. Again, magically thinking about electrocution, choking possibly, a seizure, vomiting. Was just thinking of all the worst things that his wife could have seen on the baby monitor that wasn't even with her. But that's where his mind went, and he had this terror. That's the most afraid he's probably ever been in his life. He runs into the room, sort of throws the door open, snatches this perfect baby who's sleeping peacefully out of the cot, and then holds it up and sort of looks and just checks and holds her little head to his ear to make sure she's breathing, and looks for vomit and runs through a checklist of morbid but possible situations or outcomes that could have come about. And he's just terrified more than anything. And then through the noise of the screams, he hears a signal, and he sort of pieces together a sentence that his wife keeps saying over and over again. And she's saying he's in the house. And then suddenly this doesn't make sense, because by now he's realised it's got nothing to do with the baby, and he doesn't know who he is or why that would be so alarming. But what happens when you have really big emotions? They don't disappear. They sort of just redirect, become something else. They sort of calcify, I think. So this fear cooled and developed this really sharp edge of rage and anger. Quite instantly, he was no longer as afraid as he's ever been. He was as angry as he's ever been. And he sprints through the house with his baby, and he sort of offloads the baby to his wife, who by this stage is saying he's got the car keys, he's in the yard. And the night before, they'd had a party at the house, and there was some empty, they had drinks, less of a party, they had drinks, and there was some empty wine bottles on the kitchen bench to go into the recycling. And just in a split second, he thought, I should grab a weapon. But then he thought, this person he was imagining someone who was drug addicted or homeless, or someone he could easily overpower. He didn't really think too much about it, but he was angry. So he ran and he threw the door open of his car, and he saw someone quite calmly adjusting the mirror and putting his seatbelt on and moving the seat back. And this made him angrier, because what is this person doing? They're a thief, they're desperate. Why are they so calm? And he loses it and for a few seconds attacks this man. And then he's screaming, "Get out of my car." He's swearing, telling him to get out. And the neighbours can hear and everyone can hear, but he's completely oblivious to everything but this threat in front of him. And then he realises that he can't get out of the car because he's blocking the door. So the thief is trapped in the car, and until he steps back, he can't get out. So he steps back and raises his hands, and he says to the man, "Just go, I won't call the police." He swore a lot. There's some F's and some C's. But he was conveying the message that, look, you're safe to go, just get out of the car and leave. And the thief, stepped out of the car and sort of approached him a little bit. And for a split second, he thought, this has actually worked. He was relieved. For just a split second, he thought, this guy's doing what I'm saying. This worked. And then he looks at the man. The man approaches him and is sort of standing like this. And his eyes sort of ventured down to where his fist is clenched hard against his thigh. And he steps forward like this. And in his hand is a rather large knife. And so he thinks about his daughter, who he was originally fearful of, and is suddenly thinking about his wife, and is thinking about the news stories he's seen about home invasions that have ended and people being stabbed and people being maimed and people being hurt. And the man continues to come forward, and he continues to step back until he is next to a chair they have in their courtyard, and he holds it in front of him and he says, just take the car and go. I'm going to leave that story there. What sort of crime writer would I be if I didn't suspend the action and give you some of the boring backstory? So I'll tell you another story while I've got you on the hook. If you so imagine you're driving home from Tauranga through the back roads, and you're coming over, and you should fly through there. It's late at night, but up ahead you see some lights, some red lights, and some cars have slowed down, and suddenly there's traffic, and there shouldn't be traffic in the middle of the night through the gorge there. And then as you get close and the cars sort of, slowly move forward, you see some police lights, red and blue flashing lights. Then you see an ambulance, and then you see another police car, and then as you slowly move past them, you see a car that's upside down or wrapped around a tree. And I want you to ask yourself, what do you feel when you see that? What sort of goes through your mind as well? For me and for most people, it's more intellectual, although you do probably feel a little bit like, oh, imagine if that was me. There's probably some, I hope they're all right. But mostly it's sort of curiosity. I wonder what happened here, because I think it's adaptive. You think, how can I avoid that happening to me? There's all sorts of things that go through your mind, but it's not as a potently emotional experience as it could be. But as you get closer to the car, you recognise the car and the number plate, and you begin to realise you know this person. And now I want you to imagine that and how that feels. And it's a distinct sensation to the first case where you do feel a little bit, but you mostly think. In that instance, you feel a lot, and you sort of block out a lot of that kind of cognition and thinking. It's just sort of panic. Suddenly you're invested. You might stop and run over and help. Suddenly you want to know if this person's okay. Really want to know if this person's doing okay. And that's the kind of gut feel, that kind of reaction. And that's what, in crime writing, that's the stakes. So as a writer, ultimately, and in all fiction, really, but certainly in crime fiction, if the readers aren't inhabiting the characters and aren't empathising with them to that extent, it's a pure intellectual exercise, there's nothing wrong with that. Lots of those old murder mysteries were sort of like Sudoku, right? You're sort of engaged to the extent that you're trying to, you're just trying to figure out what happened, more than you sincerely and in a guttural sense care about these characters, who it's happening to. So there has been some changes, I think, since the golden age of detective fiction and crime fiction, in terms of what readers expect and what a good crime novel can do. And as I said, what all good novels should really aim to do is create characters that are so real that they can be wholly inhabited by the reader in the reading experience. And that sort of dream state we experience when we're reading a good book. To achieve that and to, as I said, sink the readers into that character so wholly that they experience it like that crash when you recognise the car. So, back to the home invasion situation. I'm sure most of you probably figured out, this happened to me. I was the person who ran like an idiot through the house, had probably one of the worst days of my life, had this horrible sinking feeling that I could, like an idiot, I've just run into a situation where I could be really hurt. And that's not really thinking about my family, who I was trying to protect in that moment. Another thing happens when you think about this story and it being about me and you consequently knowing that it's true, is it's more of a gut punch in the same way that a fiction is imagined with a level of exactitude, but also with enough precision in the details, and the imagining by the author is deep enough and complex enough that when they put that on the page, you can see the world, right? You forget that it's a story and you can imagine it as something that's really happening. So in both those cases, certainly the idea that you know the person and hopefully empathise, if not with me, then my wife and my child, if you can kind of recognise a shared humanity or a sort of shared common experience with this person, you can also call upon readers to ask questions of themselves, right? So you might have, when I was telling that story and you discovered it was me at the end there, you might have thought, what would I do? Would I have run straight into it like an idiot? Would I have grabbed the bottle? Would I have gone to my daughter before my wife? You might hopefully inhabit that situation in the sense that you ask a moral question of yourself, right? What is the right thing to do as well? So there's all sorts of things you can unpack, but it only works and only happens if you care, one, about the story, but two, about the characters, as far as I'm concerned. So I get asked quite a bit where I get my ideas from, and so in anticipation for that question, I have a good example. I talk a little bit about, what's his name? Neil Gaiman tells a story that I find quite interesting and true, although it may be apocryphal. I didn't hear it from his lips, but he tells a story where he, whenever he's asked where do you get your ideas, he says, what I do is there's a little street in London, it's off this avenue over here, he's got names for the streets, and you walk halfway down, you turn left and there's a blue door, and what I do is I'll go and knock on that door, and then I say a password, and when they open the door, it's just a room full of ideas. And you can just go and pick anyone off the shelf and take it home and write it. And I guess what he's saying is it's completely invisible and magical, and no one really understands where their ideas come from, although we can find ways to, I find, jar loose certain ideas, if that makes sense. Sort of, I find walking, obviously, like a certain level of exercise, I think is really good for working through knots and holes and problems, and also just idea generation. But the other thing I do is I keep a notebook, a little bit like this. This is from the hotel, actually, but I'll keep a notebook about that size often, or my phone on me, and if I see something or experience something I find affects me in any way, I'll often jot it down. And it's mostly useless, it's mostly hopeless. I sort of call it, what's this, like manure, you know? Shit. No, it's like manure. Like I just know it's worth keeping, and if I put it on something, eventually, it might grow. I know that it has purpose and things can grow out of it, but in isolation, it's shit, right? So I do this, and then I'll go back to that if I'm stuck, and I'll often look for ideas and look at things. But one time, you're going to find through this talk that I'm very lucky to be married, by the way. So I'll tell you a story about my wife. One time I had a great idea. Again, my little daughter was very young. I think it was around September, October, probably about 3 months old. We went to the beach. We took a Moses basket, which is like a little bassinet thing that you can take around. We laid it down on the sand and put her in it, and then we lied down on the sand, and it was quite warm for that time of year. And Victorians don't know how to swim, or Melbourneites don't know how to swim in the sea. Does everyone know that? They just don't know how to swim in the sea. And they go and get themselves drowned a lot because Port Phillip Bay is a sea beach technically, but doesn't get any waves. And then they go to a surf beach, and anyway. So me and my wife were at the beach, and we were lying down nice and hot. She gets up and says, I'm going to just go for a quick dip. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty rough. Okay. She goes, I'm going to go on this little calm patch over here. I was like, brave. And then I said, just before you go, I haven't got my phone on me. And it's true, I didn't have my phone on my notebook. And she goes, what's up? I go, I just had an idea, and I do this quite a lot. I'll say, send me a text message. She goes, okay, I'll text you. She goes, what is it? I said, okay, husband and wife on the beach with their baby. She's like, okay, sure. And I go, and it's quite hot. No one else is on the beach at all. Make sure you put that. The beach is empty, on a beach, quite rough surf. The wife starts to get a little bit hot, wants to go for a swim. She's like, typing away. She's like, what is this? What's this idea? I said, right before she goes, she points where she's going to go, walks out into the water, doesn't realise it's a rip, and is sucked out to sea. she just goes, she's like, I'm not sending it. I go, no, trust me, send me this, it's good, it's really good. And I'm like, and then the husband has to decide if he stays with the baby to keep it safe or if he goes out to save his wife. And still married, surprisingly, just holding on after that one. But she sent it to me. I went home that night. I wrote it down into my notebook. And my latest book, which is somewhere here, I was stuck. And it was. I don't often have a deadline where it's a hard deadline, because I usually am a little bit ahead, and I'm pretty good at keeping on top of what's in front of me, and I'm pretty good at not overcommitting as well. I know I often won't commit to a pub date until I at least have a first draft and a bit to work with. But this was for Audible originally, and they're owned by Amazon, and it's sort of a cog, and you're just part of that. You're a cog in a much larger, aggressively capitalistic machine. And so anyway, I had a deadline for this, and the book wasn't any good, and I was just like, what can I do? And I was working for a structural edit, and it just wasn't working that well. And I went back to my notebook, and I found that scene, and quite suddenly it unlocked the potential of the story, and everything changed. And it's that thing, when you think of ideas, this is my view anyway, there's not much that's new. And they say, like, artists only have one original thought or idea, right? One thing that's truly novel, truly original, truly unique, and they just sort of repurpose and repackage it for their career. I think there's probably some truth in that, but I also think there's so much to explore in clashing two ideas together, clashing worlds together, and bringing two different things, and just doing that and seeing what happens. I sort of say it's like if you throw enough plates at a wall, you can build a mosaic out of all the pieces, right? Which seems like an ineffective and slow way to do it, but I just do that. I just keep kind of crashing things together until something unlocks and something begins to work. So that's I guess where my ideas come from. I don't know why they all tend to be crime stories, but I'm drawn, I think, to the idea of crime and the potential of I guess also just the idea of crime as a broad church. So I should say, certainly Evie, I wrote as a literary novel the first time around, and then we sort of edited it and teased out the parts that were strong, and that really worked. And I was shocked and surprised to see it on the crime shelf. No one told me or warned me. And then I discovered that crime novels tend to sell better than literary novels, so I was okay with it in the end. But it was a real shock. And then I think also it was my editor and publisher recognising and editing me towards my strengths and towards what I do possibly do well, and that's I think write about dark things, write suspense, and write thrillers. And I think I'm drawn to it for the same reason readers are drawn to it. And I think readers are most often drawn to certainly the contemporary crime novel as a form of escape, but also it's that, what I mentioned earlier, that finding at the heart of every good crime story that moral question, right? I think moral philosophy, it's not too lofty, I hope, to suggest that most really good crime novels have that kind of one single distinct question right at the heart of it. And often that question is, what would I do in this situation? But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, is it morally permissible to have an affair? Is it morally permissible to commit an act of murder if it's to prevent another act of murder, and all sorts of things like that. So I think that's why most people are drawn to crime. I do think also, I personally have this fascination with often Pākehā, white women, obsession with true crime podcasts about white women who are being killed. It's so bizarre. I think maybe they want to run faster and they've got it on. I don't know, but it's a real fascination of mine. But it's also a phenomenon that is pretty well documented. And so, yeah. So I don't know if that's morbid. I don't know if that's. I don't know why we do that. That particular form of. I don't know. It's a really strange question. without a clear answer as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure psychologists will probably be able to unpack that a bit more. But I'm always confused why people like to read about crimes committed against people like them. And I don't know if it's anger, I don't know if what they're tapping into. But anyway, so I think the other thing people asked about my childhood because they think I must have been abused. Only by bullies, no. No, I think it's funny because trauma is such an odd thing. Like I lost my mum when I was really young. That was pretty traumatic. But there were other things. You grow up on a farm and you see some stuff that, like, I wouldn't let my daughter see, that's for sure. But I remember it was quite fun to watch the butcher just opening lambs' throats, and we'd sit on the fence and just watch the butcher, like, kill a whole bunch, 20 animals in the space of a couple of hours or a few hours. And I always thought that was a real core memory. I remember that so clearly. I remember the smell and sort of the rope of blood that comes out initially, and it's not quite red at first. It's almost like there's some sort of green or something in there that, for me, the red was when it hit the concrete, but there's always seemed to be another colour in there. So, I mean, this is pretty morbid, but I do think maybe I'm drawn to it to unpack some deeper psychological issues. Again, if there's a psychologist in the room, we can chat about that after. The power of crime as well as a genre, and the reach. So if you read literary fiction, I'm sure many people in the room do, you're probably reading about things you already know, understand, or like, or it's sort of an expertise almost, like you're just getting in slightly more insight into something you already believe or know or understand. Where I view crime, even romance, even sci-fi, sci-fi in particular actually, but I view all these as potential Trojan horse art forms, right? Because the people who are reading literary fiction already often are pretty intelligent, to be fair, but also they have a recognisable sense of the reality of the world, if that makes sense. We don't have a kind of common reality anymore, right? Like we can all see that. We all can more or less detach from, as I said, a common sense reality. But I think people who read enough do get enough perspective and insights into other worldviews and things like that. And that happens in literary fiction. But in commercial fiction, the audience and the potential for exposure to new ideas, new cultures, the potential's really there in commercial fiction because this is an escape read. They're not going to this place to be enlightened in any way or to understand a different culture or a different perspective or anything like that. They're often going to this place to escape. And genre readers are not necessarily politically engaged or savvy to workers' rights, for instance, or whatever. They're not necessarily politically motivated in any sense. They don't really want to know about this stuff. So when I say it's crime and romance and genre fiction, can be Trojan horse novels. Crime's the biggest genre. Romance is the biggest. The two biggest genres in the world by a mile. It's not even close. And so that sort of reach and the potential of that reach can't be ignored and can't be scoffed at. So I do like the idea of the crime novel as a Trojan horse, also as a vector for young writers who are often working class, right? The domain of literary fiction tends to be those people who can afford an arts degree for starters, but also those who can afford to not earn their own money as well. I find in Australia in particular, the literary community are all privately educated. Their parents all live in very affluent suburbs, right? Whereas crime fiction is very much a vector for the working class writers. And I do view it in a sense that if you are of a certain... I was always encouraged to write literary fiction because I think if you're brown or if you're from a minority group or if you're in any way representative of a different culture, there's this expectation on you to also be a certain writer, and it's almost like you have to tell a certain story because that's your value, right? That's your cultural value, is to enlighten people from other perspectives, other worlds. They want to be enlightened about what it's like to be this or that. And I love that, as I love those sorts of books, but also I think there is an issue where, and it's worldwide, but certainly in New Zealand where there is an expectation of young Māori writers to sort of move away from genre and to focus on important stories. And for instance, there's an author, Amo Jones, who is a huge mega romance seller that no one in this room's probably heard of. And she's from here, she's from Rotorua. And she just sells loads of books. And she's got a far greater reach than most New Zealand writers, I'd say. And so that's why I like crime, that's why I go to crime. And I read books, there's S.A. Cosby's name. So there's all sorts of American authors that are writing American minority experiences in crime fiction and showing me a new world via crime. And I'm there for the story, but I'm also getting this other world. I'm getting insights into this other world as well. And a good example of this, I was in a writers' festival in Perth, it was great. It was good fun. Actually, it was Margaret River, south of Perth, and there was a Māori fellow in the crowd, and I recognised straight away when I was talking. And afterwards, he came up, a really lovely guy, had been there for 20 years or something. And he goes, I saw you on the program, and I wanted to come along. I brought my son. I'm like, oh yeah, we're having a chat. He goes, don't really meet too many Māoris out in Margaret River. And I said, don't mention it too loud though, because if they realise, they'll put me in with all the academics and panels and sessions with them. And so I was like, just keep it. No, it wasn't like that. But it was quite refreshing, and it's also, he's been in contact and read my books and stuff, and I think when I think about the experience I've had as a writer, the most exciting ones have been catching up with folks from my hometown, from New Zealand, that can recognise elements of my story that are true to their experience as well. So there's that side as well. I've got a little bit of time left, so I'll just talk for a little bit longer. Then, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. There's this other thing in crime fiction that's kind of come over from other worlds in the literary community. To write what you know has always been a thing, but certainly there's own voice is a sort of movement which I am, in a broad sense, a fan of. And again, I'm not an expert, but it's sort of this idea that you should only write from your own experiences and your own voice. And I like it mostly. I mostly like it. But also at the same time, my most recent book I wrote about an alcoholic middle-aged woman. And I'm only one of those things. So I get that question quite a bit. And my perspective, again, just in terms of my own experience, and this is something that shifts. I'm politically pretty fickle when it comes to stuff like this. But my view of even this question of own voices is I think eventually, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, the terrifying thing is we'll only write autofiction or non-fiction, right? If you just go all the way to the end of the line, and I think that's, I'm embarrassed to say, I think that's a world that sometimes some people want, but universally in the crime community, I think, and speaking with most writers, I think it's something that writers don't want. They want some sort of license. And again, in anticipation for this question, I think the most important thing is to do research and to read books from this experience. I think if you were to write, I think there's been a couple of books in Australia, and they're not as discerning as Kiwis, and it's usually in quite bad taste. But there have been a couple of books that have been written from trans characters and things that have been, in my view, quite exploitative. So that's a bad way to do it, but I also think there's a right way to do it. And as I said, just reading books from this perspective, memoirs often, non-fiction, making sure you avoid as much as possible tropes, although this is crime fiction, let's be honest. But trying to avoid tropes and problematic kind of perspectives, so I think there is a way to do it. There's that ethics of crime fiction, which seems again like a oxymoron, ethics in crime fiction, because it does at times feel exploitative, particularly in true crime when you're telling stories about people who've been disfigured or maimed or hurt or killed, or their family's been killed, and someone comes in, some sort of ghoul comes in with a recorder and tries to tell this person's story on behalf of the family. And stuff like that is morally grey as far as I'm concerned. But I think in terms of the ethics of crime fiction, it's now we want to make sure that the victims in particular have some sort of almost advocacy. They have some, they're much more central to the story, that you can no longer have a dead body on the first page, as far as I'm concerned. And if you do, I won't read that book. There was a book published in Australia that thankfully disappeared without a trace. I won't name names, but on the very first page, a woman is just literally stoned to death, and then anything you hear about her is just basically how much of a promiscuous young woman she was. And it was in private, because we're such a small community that no one says anything mean to anyone else. In private, everyone said it was abhorrent and it shouldn't have been published, a really bad book. And I think that's the extreme as well, is in terms of the victims and representations of sexual violence and things like that. I think we've grown up in the crime community, and the modern crime novel, you do, hopefully and thankfully, I think you see much less beautiful blonde bombshell dead on the first page, and you never hear about her. You do see much less just gratuitous violence, endless gratuitous violence. That does have a place in horror, I suppose, but you do, for a while there, you'd see it in crime. I don't know if anyone's read the early Lee Child stuff, but there's just like 1 million bodies, right? There's no one left in LA or wherever those books are set. So there is. I'm relieved, but also at once relieved and terrified by the prospect of the changing landscape of crime, because I don't want to be left behind. I want to be part of it. But it's definitely happening. There's definitely a kind of more slightly, in my view, more ethical approach to the stories we tell and why we tell them and who gets to tell them. So that's it. I'm going to finish my story about the car, because I know you were dying to know. So the guy, it's a funny story. The guy, it's not funny. It's quite sad. No, the guy, they got him. I think it was 2 nights later, we got a call. Police always do this, by the way. Cops called us at 4 a.m. Immediately after it happened. It's like, we're sleeping, guy, in a hotel. We don't get this much. Can you call back in the morning? No, he called at like 4 a.m. and said, we've got your car. We've caught the guy. There was a police chase. We spiked the tyres. And he said, you can go and view the car and pick it up. So they got him. He was one of the 2 that they suspected. At that moment, when he pulled the knife and I had the chair, he sort of nodded at it. Like it was like this. He was like, I was just standing right there with a chair kind of backed up against the house. And he sort of did this. He goes, like that at the knife. And I was like, that seems like quite a young, immature thing. You know, like it's almost like you'd do that on the rugby field, like at someone who's about to take a tap. And he did that, and then sort of like I kind of nodded, I don't know why, sort of agreed, like, yeah, that's a knife, yeah. I see that weapon in your hand. And then he just got back in the car, seatbelt on, safety first, and then shot off. And then I just ran out to the street. By that stage, I think the cops turned up probably a minute or so late, like really quickly turned up. Task force that was, in charge of investigating. Like I said, at the time there was a great many home invasions, and so there was all these cops swarming the house. Teams of them coming in, and there's a crime scene team come in and collect their booty. They pull all their little prizes out, they do their fingerprint and leave all this dust everywhere and take stuff away, and that was quite interesting to watch. And as a crime writer, I was sort of quite interested in that, actually. And they interviewed me, and by the end I was asking them the questions. I was like, okay, cool. So tell me, how quickly does a body begin to decompose? So it was terrifying. It was a really horrible experience, but they got the guy. When we went to check the car out, we wanted to write it off, because there's something like my wife, probably until, this might be the first trip. This is 3 years later. It might be the first trip I've gone on solo where she hasn't gone to stay somewhere else when I'm away, because she's been so terrified of being in the house. And it was a thing for her. She was sitting at the coffee table and doing her work, sitting at the dining table, and she heard the door open, and in her mind she thought Josh has gone around the house for some reason. She heard the roller door coming up, then she heard the back door open, and then she's had this feeling. She knew someone was in the house, but she needed to prove it was me. And she got up and opened the door, and he was a foot from her, and that's when she screamed. And of course, then we didn't know he had a knife. But we didn't want the car because for some reason, again, trauma does odd things to the mind, right? Because he'd been in it, we didn't want to be in it. So we went to see it anyway, hoping it would just be a write-off. And fortunately it was, but it was full of condoms. Like condom packets, and so we're like, oh, and there was little drug baggies and all sorts of stuff in there, and we're like, please just be a write-off. And so they wrote the car off, and yeah, all is well, that ends well. So yeah, that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
And then someone said, well, what was your connection with Makatu? Is there still a connection there? And we just felt great that Makatu was in a book.
That's why I wrote it. I'm like, I'll get some sales if I put it somewhere really small. It didn't work. I set a book in Melbourne. It didn't work as well. No. I'd say I used to go over there all the time when we were at high school, and I had two friends that had batches over there, and we had these awesome experiences. And it was a place that I used to tell people. I don't know why now. I used to tell people it was my favourite place in the world all the time. I do know why. It's lovely, but I go back and I was like, what was it about this place that I really, really loved? And we used to go there, and I guess it was just every weekend we went over there and surfed down at Nudix Beach, or just hung out at my friend's batch playing cards and drinking beers, and we just had endless memories there. And so an odd thing did happen when I wrote Call Me Evie, and I said it there. I wrote it. Takes a couple of years to edit and stuff and get published. And so by the time it's actually published now in the world, I went back to Makatu and I'm like, this place is pretty different to how I remember it. And there's all these sort of big batches and nice boats and stuff. But what the Makatu I remember is where you're not terrified of the locals, you're terrified of the local children. Like the kids I remember they'd just throw stones at our cars sometimes. And they were just fearless for like 7 or 8. Something's quite disconcerting when you're 16-year-old boy full of testosterone, and there's a little child throwing stones at you, and is just not afraid. It's like, okay, I'm getting back in the car and heading out of town. So it just struck me even back then as a place that I would like to write about. I think, yeah, cool. I think we got a question.
Oh, kia ora. I'm just wondering how you go about doing your research, around police procedures.
Yeah.
Apart from getting your car convicted.
Yeah.
But do you have friends in the police force? And what about things like mortuary stuff? That sort of thing?
Yeah.
Do you go along as an observer, or what do you do?
Are you a writer? Yeah, cool. Because this happens. I had this thing when I was starting out that I thought everything had to be really precise, and the procedural elements had to have a certain level of exactitude. Otherwise, everyone would know the story's fake or whatever. And I've got a good friend who lives by this. He calls it the 2% rule, and his name's Jock Sarong. He's a really brilliant Australian writer, but he says 2% of readers are going to know more about one thing in your book, right? They're going to understand a place more or something. He said 1 or 2% of people, readers of your work, might be historians who know more about this than you do. 1 or 2% might be police who can recognise that this isn't how it goes. He said if you write for them, you get bogged down in the details and you spend endless time researching. So research for me is often more about place, I think. I have to go somewhere. Place and character. I'm trying to understand what the setting's like, what these people who live here are like, and that sort of thing. And then that sort of stuff's fact-checking. So I do that kind of research after I've written the first draft, and often it's me asking. I do have a couple of contacts in the police, and psychologists I think have been more valuable to me in terms of the writing process than police, because I haven't written that many that are police procedurals. But you do just check and say, is this possible, I think? And if it's possible, it doesn't have to be plausible. Is it possible? Is it believable? There's a New Zealand detective, his name's Nathan Blackwell, I think, his last name. But he's helped with stuff in New Zealand. Every Australian crime writer has someone, so I'll ring Candice Fox or someone, or text like Mike Robertson and be like, hey, have you got a forensics guy? And then everyone just puts you in touch. And I think they like it because they get their little acknowledgement in the back. So, but I'd say it's less important than you think, is the other thing. The most important thing is the story's great and that there is plausibility, the possibility more than the plausibility. Because if we wrote about the most likely kind of series of events, the books would be so crap. And cops tell you this. They go, well, actually we would probably figure that out pretty quickly, And they never make great stories, right, if you do it like that. So, you always aim for the possible as opposed to the plausible, and cool.
And do you do crime writing workshops?
I do sometimes, sometimes. I try, I do them. Not that often these days, but I used to do them quite a lot. And I do them at writers' festivals, but not over here, unfortunately. But maybe in the future I'll do another one. Yeah, cool. Maybe next year, is there any other questions? How are we going for time? Cool, yeah. I'll just start picking people if there's no more questions. Cool. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I'd just like you to read for us anything at all from your
I guess, I'll read this one, Okay, I'll just read, I don't know what I'll do, maybe the start. Actually, because I told you the story, you can see how it fell into the book. It's quite long, isn't it? It was a hot day, if a little overcast. Lying on a towel on the sand, she could feel herself growing sleepy as the sun crept across the sky. The beach was almost entirely theirs. 3 teenage boys threw a frisbee at the other end toward the point, and up on the cliffs behind her, a couple of surfers were assessing the swell, leaning against the bonnet of their station wagon. Parked beside it was a tiny blue hatchback. She looked back at the sea. There was a calm patch close in. It's a steep beach that drops away sharply when you get near the water, where the waves break hard against the sand. That calm, dark patch looked so cool and inviting. She could just slip in for a moment, rinse the sun's heat from her skin, then come back to her boys on the beach. She was so tired those days. No one told her how long the sleepless period would last. A dip would freshen her up. I might cool off in the water, she said. He looked over at her, took a long sip of his beer. She saw the ocean reflected in the aviator sunglasses he'd picked out at the service station. Her 2-week-old son was in the Moses basket between them. She never thought it was possible to have a baby. She'd given up the idea altogether until it happened. Suddenly, miraculously, she was pregnant. Then late in the night, through the heat and the exhaustion, the endless, back-arching, excruciating pain, her son arrived. Bit rough out there, he said, nodding at the sea. He finished his can and tossed it by the others on the sand. I'll go where it's still, in the shallows over there. She pulled herself up, lifted her son from the basket and held him to her, kissing his forehead before laying him back down. Lastly, she adjusted the muslin cloth covering the basket to keep the sun off him. Won't be long. She glanced back at the cliffs. It didn't bother her that he'd been drinking, but she knew she couldn't indulge too much. She couldn't do anything at the moment. It was hot and he'd grabbed a couple of beers on the way here. She had a few sips of his can, letting the beer sit in her mouth. It all felt so normal, so peaceful. Maybe, she thought, just maybe they could have a normal, happy life. Maybe they could be a boring family, shift to the suburbs, take up hobbies. Anything was possible. That moment could be the beginning of a beautiful and happy life. Just in the shallows, he called after her. She turned back, of course. That's probably it, actually.